Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Again, my name's Daniel Cook. I am part of the USDA ARS Poisonous Plant Research Laboratory in Logan, Utah. Um, First of all, I want to give a little background about our lab and what our mission is, and then I want to share with you some information about some poisonous plants that I think are important for the urban and small farm setting for those individuals that primarily may deal with goats or sheep and occasionally cattle. So the mission of our lab is basically to understand everything about poisonous plants and their toxins and determine how these plants poison animals and then develop management recommendations or prognostic procedures, whatever it may be, or information that can be provided to livestock producers to reduce losses. And as part of this, we're located on campus at Utah State University, but we're part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Agricultural Research Service, which has a mission to help producers, whether it be in our case, it's to help livestock producers because our mission is towards poisonous plant research. But there's other ARS labs that may study native bees or forages or apples, depending upon which state they're located in. So our lab takes an interdisciplinary research approach to science. There's lots of different disciplines at our lab. Myself, I'm a plant biologist, but we have a veterinarian on our staff, we have a toxicologist, we have a range scientist, and we have a chemist. And all these disciplines are important to helping us understand poisonous plants because, for example, with chemistry, we need to know what the toxin is, how much of the toxin is present. The veterinarian, he's a pathologist, and he's interested in understanding the lesions that may be associated in an animal when an animal is poisoned. So all these disciplines work as a team to basically come up with core solutions that can help a livestock producer. As I mentioned, we're located on campus at Utah State University. This is an older picture. We're on 14th North. We have facilities for cattle, sheep, and goats. We also have facilities in Richmond, in north of Logan. But these facilities enable us to do our research. We collaborate with the Utah State University in much of our research. So what are some of the types of studies that we do to help answer the questions that are important to a producer? We do grazing studies where we may take cattle, sheep, or goats out into the field, and we try to understand under what conditions the animals may eat these poisonous plants. We do animal experimental studies with different animals, maybe goats, maybe cattle, sheep. And these studies help us understand what are the conditions that poison animals and what are some of the things that we can do to provide information to producers to help mitigate those losses. We also use rodents as models because the bottom line is if I can use a smaller animal to gain the same information instead of using a cow or a sheep or a goat, and I can learn that same information using a mouse, I would much rather use that mouse. It's cheaper. It's just the good ethical use of animals. And so we have different studies that we can use mice for, and we have different apparatus, different tools here that can measure different responses of how an animal may respond to different poisonous plants. So we may be able to measure its exercise tolerance using these tools. We may be able to use how different poisonous plants may cause tremors. So we have the ability to measure these things. And so rodents play an important role in our research as well as the larger livestock species. So our research impact, we focus here on the Western United States. We're primarily focused on, public rangelands because here in the Western United States, in, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, this area, there's a lot of public lands. And these public lands, cattle, sheep, goats graze on these lands, and they're exposed to poisonous plants. And most of these poisonous plants that we study are native plants. And I emphasize that much because that changes things because in management, when you're dealing on public rangelands, a lot of times we can't spray and treat those plants with herbicides because they're native plants and they play an important role. So that's one thing that's really important, is that most of these plants are native plants. Occasionally, they are introduced plants. So losses due to toxic plants. So when we consider toxic plants, it's just not the death of the animal that may occur, but there's also impaired weight gains. There's birth defects that may happen, or premature partition and abortion. And then there's indirect losses such as vet costs, increased risk, changes in management that occur. And so all these things affect a producer. And then there's the emotional distress. And I can't emphasize this enough, because when a producer loses animals, whether it be to the death of the animal or birth defects or whatever it may be, there's always that emotional distress that comes with this, and these things have to be considered as well. We estimate that here in the Western United States, that annual losses due to toxic plants is somewhere around $300 million. Moving on now to to mention a few plants, but I first want to mention a thing that I think is really important, a concept that we can't emphasize enough when it comes to toxic plants, is the idea that the dose makes the poison. And there's a famous quote here by Paracelsus from the early 15th century and late 16th, early 16th century, where he said, all substances are poisons. There's none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. And I think this is very important when we consider, things even in our own personal lives as humans. We all drink water, but too much water could poison any of us. But we all may take different medication when it's prescribed to us, and we take a very defined amount that the doctor recommends that we take. And that's because the dose makes the poison. And water, it takes a lot to hurt us, but it could poison us. And so this is the same applies to animals. There's certain plants that an animal may have to only eat a small bite of it, and it could poison them, resulting in death. While there's other plants that an animal has to eat a significant amount, and it still results in poisoning. So some concepts that I think are important when we think about this of an animal being poisoned are this idea of dose making the poison is the amount of toxin. So on the left, I have 3 cups of water, and and all 3 cups are equal in size, but the amount of toxin changes based upon those red food coloring drops. And you can see how that changes. But then there's how the size of the animal, it may influence the dose. And here you have a glass that's very full versus a glass that's small. And we could consider, a large animal, a mature animal versus a young animal. And obviously, the large animal has to eat more to get the same dose. There's also differences that one can consider in terms of sex of the animal, those types of things, age of the animal, which relates to size, but also just age. So these are all factors that may influence the dose and how it makes its poison. Next, we cover lots of different poisonous plants that we study that are of interest to us. Here's just some pictures of some of these plants. Some of these I'm going to mention today, but one thing that I see in common about all these plants is a couple of years ago, we had the Secretary of Agriculture visit our lab while he was on campus at Utah State University, and he made a comment that a lot of these plants look like pretty wildflowers. And in fact, they are. People pay money to go visit these plants in the mountains and take the time out of their schedule to visit them because they're pretty plants. And they're poisonous, but they also play a role for pollinators as well. So now I'm going to transition to talking about a few plants that I think should be considered from a small farm perspective and an urban perspective. And one thing before I want to talk about these plants is one thing that I will mention is that sheep and goats are very equivalent in most of their responses to these plants that I'm going to talk about. When in our dosing studies, we found that a lot of people have this idea that goats can eat basically anything and they're not going to be affected. And that may be true with some plants, But when it comes to toxic plants, goats behave a lot like sheep. Now, there are some differences between the small ruminants of goats and sheep and cattle, where some plants may poison cattle only, and some plants are more susceptible to goats and sheep. So that's one thing to consider is species differences. So the first plant I want to talk about is yew. And I mention this because it's an ornamental plant. And yew's found a lot of places in parks. It's found in our yards sometimes. Some people have it in yards. It's hedges. It's at church houses. But this plant is very, very toxic. It's a cardiovascular toxin that's found in it. Um, and I'll just mention an example of a case report that I recently dealt with where a goat owner, transported some goats up to a family member in the Harriman area. And the grandmother thought that the goats needed a different part, some alternative forage, and decided to feed some trimmings from her yew bushes to the goats. This resulted in deaths of several of the goats. And so I can't emphasize enough this idea that we need to be aware of our ornamental plants, and yew being one of the most common plants here in northern Utah that's an ornamental plant. The picture on the top right is an example from Cache Valley, Utah that happened about 25 years ago, where a neighbor clipped, a homeowner, which was a neighbor of the livestock owner, clipped some yew bushes and dumped them across in the neighbor's cow pen, and resulting in the death of several steers. And so again, we need to be aware as homeowners what we do with our clippings as well, that we just don't dump them and assume that they're going to be all right for our animals. One thing that I do want to mention in regards to yew is they're also poisonous to our wildlife species. A couple years ago, when we had our record snowfall, there were a number of elk and deer that were poisoned on yew that winter. And this was because the elk and deer came down to people's yards because they were running out of forages on their traditional winter habitats, and they ate plants that were green in people's yard, and yew was one of them. So even our wildlife species are susceptible to yew. Another plant to consider is death camas. It's a cardiovascular toxin. Sheep and goats are both susceptible to it, as are cattle. But the thing that I want to mention here is so this plant greens up very early in the spring. It's one of the first plants to come up after the snow melts. It looks like a wild onion. But the thing here that I want to emphasize is some people confuse it for wild onion. There's cases where children have been poisoned by death camas because they've dug up the bulb before and mistaken it for wild onion, and then eaten the bulb and ended up in the hospital. So again, this is a plant that can poison not only livestock, but can poison people as well. Another plant to consider in our small farm settings and urban settings is halogeton and greasewood. These are two plants that contain oxalates. These plants, primarily halogeton, can grow in very disturbed areas, in desert areas. And halogeton, both these plants contain oxalates that basically cause kidney failure. And so with these two plants, it's really important that we're aware of when we transport animals and move them from one location to another, that we're aware of what plants are there where we're moving our animals to, because if they eat these plants because they're hungry and they don't have the same discretion, same desire, they're hungry, and so the animal's going to choose to eat a plant that is maybe not part of its normal diet, but because they're hungry, this plant's less palatable, they're still going to eat it. And so halogeton's really important in that sense, that we watch for it in these desert disturbed areas. Case in point, we dealt with a case where a sheep producer transported a flock of sheep, and they let the sheep out, and after transporting them and weren't aware of the halogeton, and lost several head of sheep the next morning that they found dead. And one thing that's important with halogeton is if you can provide alternative forage before you transport them, and then once you release them, so they don't all of a sudden they're not as hungry because you've provided them good forage to eat. Other plants to consider are water hemlock and poison hemlock. These are native plants again. They'll poison both sheep and goats and cattle. On the top left, you see what a water hemlock leaf looks like. On the top right, you see what a poison hemlock leaf looks like. Water hemlock's the more poisonous of the two. It's primarily the water hemlock, the leaves aren't that toxic, but underneath the ground, there is a large tuber that's very toxic, and a small amount that I can put in my hand can poison an animal, resulting in death. While poison hemlock, it takes more of the plant material, but again, this plant grows along ditch banks. It grows in disturbed areas. If you take the time to drive around, you'll find a lot of poison hemlock in areas that are disturbed in our different counties in this northern part of the state. Other plants to consider that are toxic. Here I show a picture of hound's tongue on the left and ragwort on the right. These plants are generally not that palatable. The plants that I talked about earlier are more palatable than these plants. These plants are generally the type of plants that if you have like a small acreage and you may see that your animals eat a lot of different plants, preferably, and then you have green plants that are sticking up that you often may wonder, why aren't the animals eating them? Well, those plants just aren't palatable to the animal. And here are two examples of these plants, hound's tongue and ragwort. But the thing that one has to consider is obviously, generally, we're not going to have a problem with these plants when they are in our field unless we starve our animals to eat them. But the problem is when we buy our hay or our grass hay, and then we take that and we feed it to our animals. We really need to be aware of the type of feed that we're buying and that we feed to our animals, because these plants can contaminate our grass hay and even our new seedings of alfalfa that we may purchase that may be a little bit cheaper in price, but then we may pay for that cheaper in price because it's full of a lot of weeds, and sometimes those weeds can be toxic. And here's two examples. These plants are hepatotoxic. They cause liver toxicity. And one thing that also is important about these plants is when they're put up in the hay, the animal can't distinguish them when they're dry from the good hay or the good grass that you're trying to feed them. So this is an important thing to remember when we consider plants such as these. I just also mentioned this from, a humanity standpoint, is that in other parts of the world where people are living on subsistence agriculture, plants, not these two plants, but plants that contain similar toxins often contaminate grain crops. And these grain crops, because once they're contaminated, people will mill their grain into flour, and then people are poisoned by analogous plants in developing parts of the world. One other plant that I'd briefly like to mention are milkweeds. These, again, generally are not palatable. Animals will not eat milkweeds generally unless they're basically starved to them. But these milkweeds contain cardiotoxins that result in toxicity. But again, they can contaminate our hay crops or our forages, our grass hay or our alfalfa hay. And again, I can't emphasize this enough about being aware of what we purchase. I dealt with a case recently in Western Colorado in the Grand Junction area where a person that raised cows in a dry lot purchased some hay, and the hay was contaminated with milkweed, resulting in the death of several cattle. And so, again, we need to be aware of what we're purchasing. Lastly, I'll just mention two common toxic plants that are found on rangelands that may not be in our urban and small farm settings, but maybe they are if we're in the right environment. Larkspurs, larkspur or delphinium, they contain alkaloids that are neuromuscular toxins that result in the death of the animal. And one thing to mention here about larkspur, the plants that I've mentioned earlier in this talk, all those plants poison cattle, sheep, and goats pretty much the same. But larkspurs do not poison cattle. I mean, they don't poison sheep and goats, but they only poison cattle. So that's one thing to consider about larkspur versus, some of these other poisonous plants. Next is lupin. Lupin can be toxic to both sheep and goats, toxic, but it primarily in cattle, it only causes what we call crooked calf disease. And this is because basically if a cow is pregnant and she ingests lupin during a certain period of gestation, it can induce a cleft palate or it can induce crooked limbs. And so this is another thing to consider when you consider poisonous plants, is that when an animal eats a poisonous plant, if it's pregnant, some poisonous plants may affect the developing young. And so that's one thing to consider as well. And from a historical standpoint, there's some really interesting things. There's a plant called white snake root from the Midwest where the toxin is actually passed through the milk too. So that's another thing to consider. Some toxins may be passed through the milk to the young, the suckling young, and as well, some of these toxins can be passed through the milk, and then if we're ingesting that milk, those toxins can affect us. So that's another thing to consider. And one case in point in that regards, going back to this white snake root example from the Midwest, is back in the 1800s, Abraham Lincoln's mother is thought to have been poisoned by white snake root contaminated milk. And so it's just not the direct ingestion of the poisonous plant, but it's the ingestion, subsequent downstream effects that we need to consider. So one last slide, two last slides before I end and give some time for questions, is a common cause of poisonous plant problems is basically if we have an animal that's in good body condition, it's less likely going to eat toxic plants. That's just the facts. So if we can keep an animal satiated with good quality feed, we're going to have less of a problem with toxic plants. But if we have a skinny animal, we're going to increase our risk. It's the same thing for you and I. When we open our refrigerator door and we're hungry, we're going to grab whatever, is quick and easy and eat it. And it may not taste the best. It may not be the healthiest for us, but that's just us trying to meet our dietary needs. The same is true for livestock species. One last slide that I want to leave with you is we have an app that we created in conjunction with Utah State University to help livestock owners in minimizing their losses. And this app does not identify poisonous plants, but it has information about many of the plants that I mentioned today, as well as several others. It gives you some information about what are the clinical signs of this poisonous plant, what are some management recommendations to help, what's just general information about all these toxic plants. And we have this as an app that you can download. On my left, as I'm looking at, there's a QR code for Android, and on the right, there's a QR code for iOS operating system. So feel free to download that. It's available in Spanish as well. And so I think it's a great resource that we've been sharing with people. Thank you. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat, or I could feel free to just answer them verbally.
Yeah, Daniel, we have a little bit of time, and we have one question that's already been put in the Q&A. So I will read that to you.
Okay.
Steve says, I have death camas on my Elko County, Nevada property, which is highly toxic, even in small doses, to mammals and even European honeybees. But I value its attractiveness, the diversity it offers my sage/grassland, and its value to one of our native bees, which is completely dependent upon it. I do remove some of it and deadhead it to prevent it from reseeding, but it's still problematic. Do you care to offer any range management practices I might be missing?
I think what you're doing is the best thing. So death camas in regards to bees, one thing that I would mention is most of the data that it's out there suggests that only one type of bee visits death camas, at least for the mountain, the foothill death camas that is common in the Intermountain area. So your honeybees are not going to visit death camas for some reason. They stay away from it. It's not a preferred, source for them. In terms of good range management and keeping your livestock away from it, I think the key thing is just not overgrazing. Death camas populations usually are higher on years where you have more precipitation. We've noticed that, generally um, you have more plants that come up. It's in some years you're not going to have as many on dry years. We've noticed that. Now, in terms of toxicity, we don't see a lot of difference in toxicity from year to year. The toxicity is highest when that plant first comes up out of the ground. And so one thing to consider with death camas is it greens up first. But if you have a snowstorm and all your forage gets covered, oftentimes those death camas leaves are still sticking up, and one needs to be aware of that. So always making sure if unintended things happen, we always are providing enough forage to our animals that they don't start eating things that we wouldn't want them to.
Okay. Daniel Grace is asking, what are some other good resources like books on poisonous plants?
So our app is really good. There's several books that are available. One, if you just type in poisonous plants, there's a book by Tony Knight that's really good. If you really want to spend a lot of money, there's a book called Toxic Plants of North America. That's a really good resource. That has basically, I look at it as the encyclopedia of toxic plants. It has everything and anything you need to know about toxic plants. So there's a lot of good resources out there. Those are two that I would recommend. But you can find lots of different things, by typing in toxic plants books and looking at them.
Okay. Someone asked about Dyer's woad, and another common one would be deadly nightshade for homeowners.
Okay.
Can you share
Okay.
a bit more about both of those?
Yep. So Dyer's woad has the potential to be toxic if animals eat it, but I don't know of any animals that eat Dyer's woad. It would take quite a bit of dose to cause a problem. But in a typical setting, you're not going to have a problem with Dyer's woad because it's just not palatable. But if you're taking Dyer's woad and feeding it to your animal, there is a potential for it to be toxic. But the dose would be quite high. And it's just something, we don't have a defined dose that would be required. It's not something that we've studied because it's never been presented to us. And then in terms of your nightshades, nightshades are toxic, but they're generally not palatable again. And so I don't have a defined dose because a lot of these plants, we don't, it's not our goal to go find the exact dose that poisons an animal. And the other problem is if we were to do that, it would only be true for that one animal. It wouldn't be true for, every animal because there's differences between species, there's differences between animals. And so, but nightshades are toxic. They generally are not eaten readily by animals. And, but that's what I would say there.
Okay. Misty says, I've heard that larkspur is attractive to pollinators. Should I avoid planting this if I'm keeping honeybees?
No, there's no data to suggest that larkspur alkaloids are transferred. We've done some investigations where we've looked at the pollen, the alkaloid content in the pollen and in the nectar, and the amount there is not something that I would be considered a concern. And furthermore, there's no evidence that larkspur alkaloids affect humans. So that's the more important thing. Now, if you have other pollinators, There are some plants, if you read about a toxin called the pyrrolizidine alkaloids, there's plants that contain these alkaloids like hound's tongue, and those plants can that alkaloid can contaminate honey. And so there are plants that we do need to be aware of, especially if that's their only foraging resource. But if you have lots of diversity of flowers in your yard, I wouldn't be of concern.
Okay, two more questions here, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. What is the best way to get rid of most of these plants? Do you suggest herbicides or cut and remove?
Well,
What are your
it
thoughts?
depends on what you're dealing with. Obviously, if you're in a public lands, dealing on public lands, I don't advocate spraying unless your land management agency such as the Forest Service or the BLM gives you permission to spray. But if you're on private land, spraying is always an option. I don't advocate spraying. It can be the best solution if you're having a problem, but a lot of these plants, like I said, are important native pollinators, important for them. So it's trying to learn to live with them if they pose a problem to you as well. But if they're posing a constant problem, spray them. That's a great step. It's also, you could mow some of them. You can pull them if it's a small acreage and remove them from your field. It all depends upon what your end goal is and where your problem lies. Again, a lot of these plants, it's not just one bite. So if you have one plant in your field or in your acreage, it's not going to be a problem. But so one has to consider the density of the plant as well. So I would take all those factors into account.
Okay, great. There's one more question so far, Daniel, and I'm going to ask you to answer that in the Q&A section
Okay.
about Dyer's woad in the hay.
Okay.
But I really appreciate you being here and sharing this information. I think it's really helpful, and it's a question that we get a lot about, plants
And one
and
thing that I would just recommend is if you go to USDA ARS Poisonous Plant Research Lab, there's our contact info on our website as well, and our phone number. Our app also has our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to us. We want to be a resource to people and try to answer questions.